Hello YouTube family, welcome back to the channel. Today Dawn and I are going to talk tomatoes. I'm Jerry.
And I'm Dawn.
And we're
living the Newcomb life.
Alright guys, so on today's video, Dawn is just going to go over probably some very generalized questions that some of you might have about growing tomatoes, and I'm going to do my best to try to answer some of those questions.
So basically, some of the things when you're planting your tomatoes, like we started ours inside under grow lights, but you don't have to do that. You can start them seeds in the garden if you want to. You will be slightly behind in the growth season if you plant your seeds outside, because tomatoes are a tropical plant.
Right, and you have to wait until the very last frost. So for us, we are in zone 7, and the date that is kind of a go-by for us is right around Mother's Day. So anytime after Mother's Day, we are generally safe to plant in the ground right after that. And that could be seed starts or from seed. The only thing is, like Dawn said, if you're planting from seed, you're going to be that much farther behind the growing season. So tomatoes, if you can, you should always try to start those indoors from seed, or you could purchase them from your big box store,
Lowe's,
farmer's market,
Depot,
whatever it is, like that, and then you don't have to worry about any of that.
I think we started ours probably six or 8 weeks before Mother's Day.
Right.
And I felt like our tomatoes were at the point, like we were saying, we have got to get these in the ground. And we planted them, I believe it was the weekend after Mother's Day, which is a typical grow or typical plant time for our grow, like our area. But you definitely want to make sure whatever the last frost is in your area, that's when you want to put your tomatoes in the ground.
Right. So when you do go to plant your tomatoes, you always want to plant them a lot deeper than what the plant itself looks like.
Yeah.
The reason is because a tomato in its normal growth season, it doesn't grow the way that we want it to grow. We want it to grow up because we're trying to get it to produce the fruit so that we can get the fruit off and consume it ourselves. But the tomato plant itself does not want to do that. The normal growth for a tomato plant is, once it gets so high, it actually lays down on the ground, and it's trying to grow as long as it can in a short period of time. Because what that does is, as it's growing along the ground, the stem of a tomato has very tiny hairs on it, and then those hairs actually become roots. So as it's traveling along the ground, it'll make its own roots as it's going, and it'll keep growing as far as it can. Now at some point it will grow shoots out of that stem area, and it will eventually bear fruit, but it only does that to preserve the species. It wants to make that fruit to make the seeds to make more plants later on. So, but it's not near as the amount of fruit as what we try to get a tomato plant to produce. That's why you always see a tomato in a tomato cage, or using trellis twine or something like that, so that it'll grow up, because what that does is it forces the plant to start producing fruit, and as much of it, rather than in the wild where it really would not do that. Now, there are two types of tomato plants that we need to point out. There's a determinate plant and an indeterminate plant, and they basically are exactly what they sound like. A determinate plant is already set up to get a certain height, and it'll produce a certain amount of fruit. Once that fruit is harvested, that plant is pretty much done. An indeterminate
So the
plant,
determinate plants are perfect for growing on your patio, because they don't, they're not going to grow 7 feet tall. They're going to grow 3-4 feet tall, and they're going to make tomatoes that you can walk out on your patio and take off, and then once that is done, it's done.
But I would still recommend putting those in some sort of a tomato cage or some sort of a bracing system to help that plant. Now, an indeterminate tomato will grow as long as the season goes, and we have had tomato plants get like right at 10 feet tall.
One year it was crazy. We couldn't even reach the top of the plant. It was so tall.
And then we left for vacation, and when we came back, it didn't break off, but it laid over, and it was about 6 to 6.5 feet high. And we had tomatoes going up the stem and then back down the stem.
Yeah,
we probably had 1,000 cherry tomatoes.
Yeah,
that year.
and unfortunately,
crazy.
We couldn't pick them fast enough because we were away on vacation, and they started cracking, and so we ended up having to throw out put in our compost pile a whole bunch of cherry tomatoes. That's probably why we get our volunteers every year.
We get volunteer tomatoes now.
Yeah. So one of the things about planting the tomatoes is when Jerry was saying that you would plant it deeper than you think. So for instance, tomatoes, when you grow them indoors or even outdoors, they're kind of spindly and long and leggy when they grow up until for a while, and then they get really top heavy. So the further down that you can plant them, the more stability that plant will have, at least until it gets to the point where it needs a tomato cage.
Right. So once it's to about a foot tall, then you decide where you want to plant it. In our area, tomatoes grow best for us in the ground in our flat garden. And so what you do is you have the root base. Let's say that's about 3 to 4 inches, but the plant itself is about a foot tall. Well, you look at the amount of leaves that you have on it, and you want to pluck off any leaves that are closer to the bottom, so you only have a small cluster of leaves at the very top. And then you want to plant it so that literally only about 3, maybe 4 inches of that plant is above the ground, and everything else you want below ground. And the reason is just what I said before. That stem is going to produce so many roots that it is going to be so much more beneficial for that plant. It'll grow 10 times more roots than just that small root base. It'll help establish it in the ground, and you'll see your stems really start to fill out, because not only is it stable below the ground, but the stems will get real beefed up so that it'll be stable above ground. But it is going to come to a point where most tomato plants are going to have to be caged or helped out in some way. Right.
Yeah. I mean, those little hairs that are on there are really cool in the aspect that we have literally pulled tomatoes out of our tomato plants out of our compost pile with no roots on them, mind you, stuck them in a grow bag, and they grow.
Yeah, we hardly even water them or anything.
Yeah,
and
the
they
one
just
year
grow.
I thought it was really funny. We had a tomato plant that somehow we missed a sucker on it, and the sucker was probably about 6 to 8 inches long. And I laughed when we plucked it off. I was like, it's a shame to throw this away. And we had a tub that we had plant radishes in, and for some reason that year they didn't take, so the tub was practically empty. And I said, oh, let me just stick it in this tub and see what happens, ha ha ha, laughing. And do you know that thing gave us more tomatoes, I think, than most of our other plants.
It was
so
it was
yeah,
great.
just kind of funny. So when you plant the tomatoes in the ground, is there anything that you suggest to put in the hole when you're planting to give the plant like the extra nutrients to get a good head start, or is that not necessary?
Well, so any plant you're going to need fertilizer. It's going to help out. If you're not sure what to do about fertilizers, you can always go with just the very generic 10-10-10. Just a real quick understanding about what the 3 numbers are on fertilizer. The first number is nitrogen. Nitrogen deals with green growth. So any of your new plants, anything that's new is green. It doesn't have flowers or fruit yet. So you want to give it more nitrogen. Whereas once they start to bud and produce fruit, now you want that higher second number. That will help it produce fruit, and it'll produce very good roots. Now the third number is just the overall growth of the plant. So when in doubt, you can go with just a regular 10-10-10. But if you want to get a little more specific, once it starts to flower and bloom, you want a lower first number and the highest second number and a lower-ish third number. So for instance, once my plants really start to get going and I really want to focus on the fruit of those plants, I have a fertilizer that is it's a 147852. But when I start my plants, I go with a higher nitrogen, which is like a 1044, because they're small, and it just helps them get a really good start. Fertilizer stuff is not that difficult. You just do a little bit of research, and it really does help out in the long run.
So once you get the plants in the ground, they're probably about a foot tall, 8 inches to a foot tall when you first put them in the ground. If you've grown them indoors beforehand, you plant them in the ground, and then when they get to be about a foot and a half tall is when, at least for us, that's when we notice that they start to fill out. They start to get real full. Sure. And you'll start to see your blooms. I think the first step, once they get to that probably foot and a half stage, wouldn't you say 14 inches?
It depends on the plant,
16 inches, something like that.
Yeah.
Is that you'll start to see in the crook of the plant, you'll have the main stalk that goes up, and then you'll have these branches that come off, and in the crook of the branch, you'll notice that little suckers will grow in there. And the best thing to do is to pluck those suckers off every time you see them.
Now here's a small tip. So if you don't have a big budget for tomatoes, but you want to get started, you could buy one tomato plant from a big box store or whatever and plant it. And then, like for instance, in a tub, I would recommend not putting any more than, say, 4 tomato plants in a tub, at least the tubs that we grow. And so you plant the first one, and then once it starts to grow, just like Dawn said, in the crook, so between the branch and the stem, you'll see this middle branch start to form. You want to let it get probably about 6 to maybe 8 inches long. You want to pinch it, all right? So you either want to use shears or garden shears, or use your thumbnail and pinch it and then pluck it off. And so it's about 6 inches, and you can literally just plant that right in the ground. And as you get suckers, you can put more in there, and you're practically getting tomato plants for free. Yeah. That's one of the techniques that we've used in the past. It works. It extends your growing season some, but then as the season goes on and you get to the end of that season, you do have to watch out when it starts to get cold. Now, you don't get as many tomatoes up front, but you will get tomatoes throughout the whole season.
Right. Like for instance, also with us, there are different kinds of tomatoes. You have cherry tomatoes, which are the little small ones. There's grape tomatoes and plum tomatoes that are getting a little bit bigger. There's beefsteak tomatoes, there's slicers, and there's paste tomatoes, and all of them look similar but grow slightly different, is at least what we've noticed. And we notice a lot of difference in maybe, for instance, how bushy the plant gets, or the blooms, what the blooms look like. For cherry tomatoes, some of them will almost the blooms will come out almost like grapes do. It's like ding, 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 ding down the stem. But keep in mind that when you plant your tomatoes, you want to plant the kind that you're looking for. Like a slicing tomato, one that you put on a tomato sandwich, is like a beefsteak tomato or the Jet Star tomato that we planted. We actually have both of those varieties in the garden right now. The Roma tomatoes or a sauce tomato is made for pizza sauce or spaghetti sauce, or it has more meat in it and less
Seeds.
pulp and seeds,
Right.
so that you can get a better paste, or if you want to make ketchup or tomato paste, or
Yep.
whatever you want to make. Back to pruning and the suckers. One of the things you really want to make sure when your plants start to grow up is if any of your branches are touching the ground, you wanna pinch those off, and you can replant them or you can throw them away, because if they touch the ground and stay on the ground, if there is any disease in the ground that affects the tomato plant, it will take over your tomatoes in a heartbeat.
And not only that, but you want to take those lower branches off anyway, because it helps with the airflow,
Yeah.
or any kind of white moss, or anything that's going to affect your plant in a negative way.
Yeah, and once the plant sets flowers, you really want to take most of the branches off below the flowers, because what happens is, right when the plant first starts, it's saying, I've got to get up there and I've got to make leaves and I've got to build a plant.
And that helps with the high nitrogen.
Right. So
Like,
once the flowers set,
once the flowers come.
you don't want the plant saying, I still need to make more plant. You want it saying, I want to feed the flowers so we can produce fruit.
And so that's why you switch from a high nitrogen, say that 10-4-4, and then once you start seeing flowers, maybe about a week in or so, or once you see that first tomato, that's when you want to go with a high second number, that 14, 78, 52, and that's going to really put into high gear and tell that plant to make more fruit.
Yeah. So we're almost there.
Yep.
Almost to that point. And then, so all of that brings me to the situation we experienced yesterday. So we had a cool front that went through our area, lots of high wind.
Yeah.
And our garden kind of sits down in like a little kind of gully, and we catch a lot of wind down here. And when we came out this morning, a lot of our tomatoes were laying over, and we have not put our cages up yet, mostly because we planted way more tomato plants than we have ever planted
we've
before.
never planted that many.
And we only had 8 tomato cages, and we have
18 plants.
We have more than 18 plants.
Well, 18 in the flat garden.
Yes. So we had to make a trip to Lowe's, which ended up being our date night.
Right, sure.
To pick up some tomato cages,
Yeah,
so that we can brace our tomatoes, so that, because they're getting so tall now that any
Right.
kind of wind that comes along, they're top heavy and they want to lay down, which
Yeah.
is the natural way that tomatoes want to grow.
Right. So as soon as we're done here, we are going to put all of our tomato cages on.
Yeah. And then
call it a day. All right. So the way that you put the tomato cage together is it has these hooks on the end, and you just apply those hooks, and you want to make sure that all of them get hooked. And then it actually comes with these, like, it's the same kind of a tie that you get on your bread, like a twist tie. And you just, once you have it framed up on your plant, you can use these to help lock it in.
literally, once the tomato cages are around the tomatoes, you literally come out every couple of days and make sure that the branches are above the little braces,
Right.
and you're good to go.
Yeah. But if you need to, you can tie it off. If you are going to tie it off, you don't want to use wire. You want to use cloth that's about 1 inch to 1.5 inches wide.
We do have some
You can cut
clips,
strips
too.
off. Clips will help.
Yeah.
So cloth would probably work a little bit better because it doesn't damage. So long as the cloth doesn't, ball up and look like what a wire would. That's why you don't use wire, because it's going to damage the stem.
Well, it's going to want to cut the stem.
Yeah,
if
so
you use
keep it
wire.
wide, and if you need to, tie it off. But the whole thought is you want to encourage that plant to keep growing higher and higher and higher, because that tells the plant to produce more fruit. And what a lot of people don't know is you don't have to wait for that tomato to turn bright red to pick it. You actually want to pick it when it's about half green, half red, and then take it, put it on your windowsill, and let it ripen there. That's when it's going to develop the most flavor, and it's going to be the best
And that's
tasting
also
tomato
that
you'll
that
have.
period between green and red. I mean, like, when it's the perfect time to pick, just after that is when the bugs love the tomato.
Oh yeah.
You
And
will
they'll decimate
lose
'em.
your tomato if you leave it on the vine too long.
Yeah.
We have made that mistake before. We've been out of town or busy or whatever and left some tomatoes on the vine, and you end up losing that tomato that you're like, oh, I was waiting for that one to get
so long
red.
just for that one, because it's the
Yeah.
perfect slicer size. So
Yeah.
so just know you don't have to wait. But
Talking about caging your tomatoes, we have done several different methods of bracing, I guess is the best way to put it, our tomatoes. If you've watched any of our videos through the years, you will have noticed that we like to experiment to see what works best where. We have grown our tomatoes in we have attempted to grow our tomatoes in 5-gallon buckets using trellis twine. Try to say that fast. And we found that the tomatoes didn't thrive as well.
they did.
They did okay.
They did good. They produced. They just didn't produce like we
And the
thought that they would.
stems were not as sturdy. I think it's because they didn't have the room
Yeah, the
to
roots,
spread out.
It looked like the roots just got so big that they couldn't get any bigger. So that tells the plant that if it can't grow down here, then it wants to shut down up here. And that's kind of what it did. And it produced fruit, but it was almost like inferior fruit.
We did struggle a little with blossom end rot, and I think it's because
That's true.
we had to water a little bit more. Even though ours are self-wicking, I think the tomatoes were requiring a lot of water, and then when we would water them, they would get blossom end rot. So we just decided that it was better to plant in the garden. So we did that last year, and we braced with the cattle panel,
Right.
which actually worked very well. We did
Fantastic.
not get our tomatoes in the ground until late last year because we had some things going on, and so we didn't get as high of harvest as I thought we would. But the cattle panel worked great.
It worked great.
The only reason that we decided to change it this year, well, probably two reasons. Number one, we wanted to try moving the tomatoes to another spot to give that area a rest from the tomatoes this
And
year.
we were growing more tomatoes than we normally do.
Yes,
That was
and
a factor.
I wanted to grow peas this year, like a bigger crop of peas, so that we had enough that we could maybe do some canning, or at least enough to have a couple of meals. And the best place to grow the peas was on the cattle panel. And so we decided to move the tomatoes back in the garden, utilize some of the area that we'd never used before, and
They're doing
utilize our tomato cages, which we used many years ago. So we
yeah.
know they work great. So guys, if you watched one of our last videos on our garden tour, we were saying that this plant, it's a beefsteak tomato, had a strange flower on it. It looked like a sunflower. It was really big, and we were like, what is going to happen to that? We asked people about it. Other people had experienced the same thing on their beefsteak. Look at this. It's got a crazy tomato growing here. We are not sure how it's going to turn out, but it is definitely growing. So that is just some of the ideas that we had
Can you think of any other
in our
questions somebody might have?
experience. No, not
So,
really.
hey guys, if you think of any questions that we might be able to answer for you, we are not the tomato gurus by any means, though we've been growing tomatoes for quite a while, and we might be able to pass on some of our knowledge to you. Let us know in the comments below. But that's pretty much it for this video, guys. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's free and it really helps our channel grow. And hit that notification bell so you're up to date on all of our upcoming videos. But thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you on the next one.
So like we said earlier, we had a cold front blow through yesterday, and you can see, like this plant right here, you can see how it has blown over. And if you notice, like some of the other plants, there are limbs that are actually on the ground, which we don't want. So we're gonna go through and put cages on everything and clean up all the tomatoes so that we don't risk anything getting any type of disease or damage.